Welcome everyone to this session on feminist theology. It's the 6th in our series. We had Black theology last week and we go to eco-theology next week. I'm delighted to welcome Nicola Slee, who you'll see on screen in a moment. But before I begin and before Liz introduces her, let me say a prayer. Loving God, we are gathered together to listen. Make us aware that it is not just what we do that is important, but how we do it. Help us to be courageous, strong, caring, passionate, and compassionate, whatever our age, race, or circumstances. Let us bear witness to your love for all people, so that we may be a people who are peaceful and joyful. In the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So Liz, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Nicola, it's great to have you with us today. Just to introduce you a little bit, I never tire of using this book, Praying Like a Woman, which is one of Nicola's, which I use a lot. Nicola's Director of Research at Queen's Foundation in Birmingham and also Professor of Practical Theology at the Vrije Universiteit. I'm sure you can correct my pronunciation, Nicola, in Amsterdam. And until recently, she was chair of the British and Irish Association for Practical Theology. And she's also chair of the Symposium on Faith Life of Women and Girls, which it's been my privilege to attend in various times. She is the author of several books. I already recommended one. The other one that I think is brilliant is Fragments for Fractured Times, which came out just to help us all through COVID, I think. And in January, you have Improvisations on the Lord's Prayer coming out. So it's great to have you with us, Nicola, and we look forward to what you've got to say to us.
Thank you so much. I think what I'm going to need to do is just, because I'll bring up a PowerPoint on my, I'm working with 2 screens here. So let me just bring up the PowerPoint so that I know roughly where I'm going. And then I can actually kind of speak to you. I'd much rather speak to faces rather than just be looking at a screen of my PowerPoint. Right, let me just get that. So what I'd like to do is really 2 things. It's kind of, it's a talk in 2 halves, and we'll probably stop at the end of the first half, because I'm then going to go into a slightly different mode. I want to do just a little bit of an introduction to Christian feminist theology. I mean, we find feminist theology in all religious traditions, not just Christian, but obviously I'm particularly, and this is our shared context. I want to say a little bit about the historical development of feminist theology and perhaps feminism more generally, talking about the 4 waves, so-called waves of feminism, because I think that can be just a helpful way of sort of understanding some of the shifts and changes in feminism more generally, in feminist theology. A little bit about some key principles that seem to me to be absolutely vital to trying to understand what feminist theology is about. So that's kind of part 1, and really, in a sense, that's a bit of a riff off this little book. Now is really quite old. It's more than well, it's almost 20 years old. I can't believe it. 2004. But if you're very new to feminist theology, although of course it's not completely up to date, it's still, I think, and my students tell me, it's still a good general introduction to some of the key sort of concepts, and it's short and it's accessible and it's aimed at the general layperson and sort of first-year undergraduates, faith and feminism, DLT. So what I'm going to talk about in this first half, it's all in this book. But then I want to move into a slightly different mode in the second half to take a concrete example, because in a sense the first bit is going to be very big picture and big principles and big notions like patriarchy and sexism and this kind of thing. Then I thought I'd like to take a really concrete example, and this is the book that I'm just working on now and just finishing. It's going off to the print, well, it's gone to the publishers and it's just going through the copy editing stage, which is what I'm calling a series of improvisations on the Lord's Prayer. But to take the Lord's Prayer as an example of a prayer text that is central to Christianity, and in some ways could be perceived as problematic from a feminist perspective. And just talk around that and give you some examples of ways in which I am seeking to pray the Lord's Prayer in faithfulness within my tradition and in faithfulness with the past, but also in new, expansive and inclusive ways. So that's my intention, and I always have way too much material and could happily go on for an hour and a half. So I'm looking to Jane and to Liz to sort of, if you think it will be good just to pause and have a bit of Q&A, you just stop me. I'm keeping my eye on time. So let's say, we're gone 15:15 now. We have to finish at 1:50. That's right, isn't it? So if I have about 10 minutes, let's see what I can do in 10 minutes on part 1, and then pause for some conversation and discussion, and then part 2 similarly, probably about 10 minutes, and because I want to give you a chance to talk and so on. So I don't quite know where this metaphor of the waves of feminism came from, and it's a metaphor that's been used in secular feminism, but it's quite a useful one to help us think about different sort of manifestations of feminism. And the first wave starts with the 19th century. Now, of course, that doesn't mean there was nothing happening in relation to feminism before then. There are many, many roots of feminism and feminist theology, and we could all easily think of women of faith in our own tradition, who were great leaders, who were theologians, who were mystics and so on. Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, Teresa of Avila, we all know these kind of figures. But in terms of feminism as an organized movement, I think it is generally thought to begin in the 19th century with the so-called first wave. And first wave feminism was very much concerned with the struggle for equality, and particularly the struggle for suffrage, the struggle for the vote. It didn't come out of nowhere. In many ways, it actually came out of the earlier struggle for against slavery. So I think sometimes and we'll come on to think about intersectionality and the ways in which different discourses around oppression actually interact. And I think you can see some really very interesting relationships between the struggle for, and when we come on to second wave feminism, the struggle for civil rights influencing feminism, but feminism then also influencing other struggles. But the 19th century primarily was a struggle for the vote, a struggle for equality, the equal dignity and rights of women and men, against, of course, a background of women's very restricted legal rights. Women couldn't divorce, women couldn't vote, women couldn't own property. We know kind of all that stuff. And it's very interesting that some of that first wave feminism was motivated by Christian faith. So some of the key feminist leaders, particularly in the United States, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a leading suffragist, also put together with a group of others the so-called Woman's Bible, which is one of the earliest kind of commentaries on the Bible from feminist perspectives. It was republished by the Women's Press, I think. Somewhere you can buy it, and it's fascinating. And they go through all the passages in the Bible where women and gender are talked about, and they give their own kind of commentary, which is very feisty and sometimes quite funny, not scholarly, because they didn't have, because again, part of that context was women on the whole did not have access to university. Certainly very, very few women would have studied theology formally, but they didn't wait for that. They just, they spoke up. So there are very interesting connections in the first wave between faith and feminism more generally. Then the second wave feminism, and I'm old enough to remember this, and this would be the time that really influenced me hugely. After the Second World War in Europe and in the US and in the developed world, really, I think that the Second World War had a big impact on feminism, because women in the war were called out of the home to take all sorts of functions that they hadn't done before. And after the war, they didn't just want to go back to being wives and mothers. So second wave feminism, in a sense, grew out of that experience. And it continued the struggle for equal rights of first wave feminism, but it was a broader and it was a more politically charged, well, maybe that's not true to say more politically charged, but it was a broader, more radical form of feminism, influenced by things like Marxism, and it was a political movement which didn't just look at the rights of individual women, but women as a class, if you like, women as a class of oppressed, who, again, broader issues around sexuality, around the family, around the workplace, around reproductive rights. And it didn't just look for women to be on an equal footing with men, but actually it was challenging the whole basis on which society was organized. So notions like patriarchy, the whole system being patriarchy, and this kind of unequal power relationship, that was challenged. The women's liberation movement was born, and if you're too young to remember, but if you are old enough to remember things like the Greenham Common Women's Commune, anti-nuclear protests, the peace movement, women claiming the night and marches and so on, this is very much within living memory, but strongly influenced Christian feminism in the church, because women who were participating in these struggles in society were also women of faith. And this is where we start to get the first serious modern literature in Christian feminism. It's sometimes 1960, Valerie Saving, who was an American theologian, and she wrote a little essay challenging views of sin by theologians like Tillich and Niebuhr, and that's sometimes said to be the birth of second wave feminism in the 1960s. Literature over here didn't really start to appear until even the early 80s. I mean, I can remember with great excitement buying the first books that were published in 1982 and 3, Sarah Maitland's Map of the New Country, Linda Howell and Susan Dowell and Linda Perkins' Dispossessed Daughters of Eve. You could buy every book that was published because there was about one a year or 3 a decade if you were lucky. But there started to be a whole literature, and of course the movement for the ordination of women, the drive for women's ordination, but not just ordination, issues around language and where are women in theology? All these things began to be sort of born partly out of the second wave. It was a move. It came out of grassroots groups often. So again, I was very much part of, I'm sure people like Liz and Jane, some of you may have been part of groups in your own context. So some of you may have heard of the St. Hilda community, which was a group that met to worship and create our own liturgy. Janet Morley was very much part of that group that met in London and achieved a certain notoriety when the then Bishop of London, Graham Leonard, discovered that we were meeting weekly in the chapel of St. Benet's, which was part of the University of London, but also in the diocese, and he forbade us to meet in the chapel. So we moved out of the chapel and had our worship in the car park, a kind of Exodus liturgy. If we're not allowed to do it in the church, we'll do it outside the church. And somebody got onto the BBC and it made, BBC 9 o'clock news, and for a moment we all felt terribly, terribly radical and doing interesting stuff. But that little group, the Hilda community, and it wrote a book, Women Included, which went into 2 editions, and that's still worth reading. But there were lots of other groups all around the country of women and men, creating their own worship, trying to not just looking for new language, certainly that, but also more collaborative ways, less hierarchical ways, experimenting in all kinds of ways. I suppose these are the precursors to fresh expressions. Sometimes now I think people forget there was that whole movement of feminist-inspired liturgy and groups in the 80s. It's as if they didn't exist, but they did, and they did some really interesting, exciting work. I can see I'm almost out of my 10 minutes, so I better get on to the third and fourth wave pretty quickly. Third wave feminism more recently, probably beginning to emerge in the 70s, 80s, maybe even 90s, and starting to, if you like, challenge and dismantle some of the assumptions of earlier forms of feminism. Certainly, I'm starting to say feminism is a movement of white middle-class women. There are lots, you know, what about other women? What about Black women? What about other issues than gender? So the whole notion of intersectionality, that we can't look at gender in isolation from other issues, race, class, disability, ecological issues and so on. This began to, you know, qualify and nuance earlier, perhaps slightly simplistic. It's often the case, isn't it, in early movements, that they tend to be quite simple because they see one enemy, if you like, or one goal, and don't always necessarily recognize the complexity of issues. And I think third wave feminism has begun to complexify, horrible word, some of the earlier assumptions of feminism. And men began to say kind of, well, you know what, let's look at masculinity. Men have also been oppressed, if you like, by gender inequality. And then other people began to say, well, why do we talk about women's experience? Actually, gender is the issue. Let's have a broader gender analysis. And then there was a kind of backlash against feminism and post-feminisms. And it all becomes rather more confusing, if you like. And with fourth wave feminism, that has continued even more. Fourth wave feminism is sometimes identified as the feminism of the younger generation of women. And it's, if you like, it's feminism gone online. It's feminism sort of using social media and technology to pursue some of the goals that, well, in the 80s were pursued in the street. So lots and lots of online movements like everyday sexism, you know, sort of websites where people put up examples of feminism. Or there's a horrible one I found, which was basically just a website charting women who get murdered in usually in domestic situations. So, you know, counting dead women, and there's some slightly horrific ones. But we might also think of things like ecological women's activism. I mean, Greta Thunberg and the whole sort of climate activist movement, which I think does build on feminist as well as other, you know, liberation movements. So sometimes it feels, if you're an old unreconstructed second wave feminist like me, I can get a bit grumpy about all these young women who seem to be discovering feminism for the first time, as if, you know, nobody else had ever thought about these things. But that's just me being grumpy. And I guess each generation does have to discover these issues anew. And, you know, young women are taking the struggle forward, but in new ways, and using new tools and communicating with each other in different ways. Let me stop there, because I think I've had a good 10 minutes on the four waves, and see if anybody has comments, questions that you'd like to lob in.
Jackie.
Thank you very much. I joined the Quaker tradition, and I just wondered, because I think really early Quakerism was a movement.
Yeah.
And certainly it came out of the Civil War and all the equality then. And, you know, women were allowed to preach and be, you know, minister and so on. So I just wondered where you saw that in terms of your historical.
Thank you. That's a really good example. I mean, in a way, this is, so any metaphor like the four waves has its limitations, and because you're right that the Quaker, you're absolutely right. I think Quakers are often ahead of the game, and, you know, have been very inspiring in all kinds of areas of justice and social rights. But so that is certainly a sort of pre first wave example of I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough of the Quaker history to know how organized that feminist kind of struggle for women to be able to preach and so on was, but it certainly would be a very good example of the four mothers.
I think there were quite a lot of Quaker women in the first parts of the movement. They were also treated, often put in as scolds and so on, publicly vilified. But there was always the sense that women as well as men were equal before God. Really.
I think Quakers have got that that sort of radical egalitarianism, equality of all in the sight of God. Quakers have often grasped that much better than, Anglicans and the larger established churches have tended to be far more hierarchical, haven't they? And very easy for us to lose sight of that kind of radical equality of all in the kingdom. I'll come on to kingdom without a G. That we are all God's children, brothers and sisters to one another and to Christ, and that there isn't this kind of these hierarchies. I think Quakers, in their decision-making processes and the way they listen to each other and their use of silence, I think there's a huge amount to learn from the Quaker tradition that is very there's a lot of synergy between that and my understanding of feminist spirituality.
I think it's why I ended up there. It was actually it was slightly unconscious, but was my view of myself as a woman. Yes,
I understand that a lot. I don't think I could ever quite make them. I have a lot of good Quaker friends, and Woodbrook's just down the road from us in Birmingham, and I love going to Woodbrook. And this thing that I'd really miss would be the sacraments and the Eucharist in particular. That's why I couldn't make the move completely. But again, I know at the university I was with Quaker Anglicans who were both, so I know it's possible to integrate. Anybody else got a?
I think Jezza had a question, Nicola.
Yeah. Who was that?
Jezza.
Jezza.
You're on mute, Jezza. There you are.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for today. I'm really enjoying this. You didn't mention fashion. I was thinking of the miniskirt of the 60s. I was involved in that one. And that was a real revolution, the miniskirt. I wouldn't laughing over this. Yeah. Do you want to tell us something about fashions?
Yeah, thank you. I'm laughing because at one level we could think fashion is a bit frivolous and, is that a subject of serious feminist theology? But I think it's hugely serious because it's something about the embodiment of women and the way that women have themselves chosen to display and adorn our bodies, but sometimes not chosen, but the way. I think there's a lot, of course, in feminist analysis about the objectification and sexualization of women's bodies, and that we ourselves have sort of imbibed that sense of the female body as the body to be looked at by men. So it's, the female body as the object of the heteronormative patriarchal gaze. And I think that is still enormously powerful. It is changing and it's being challenged, but men, there's been a kind of increasing sexualization of men's bodies and children's bodies, actually, which is, I think, a really alarming development of recent years. But it is still the case that and you could look at women in art, you could look at women in fashion. Women are the ones to be gazed at rather than the gazers, the ones who look and the ones who see. And that's something that feminism challenges and seeks to change, but it's a slow process. And what that means in terms of fashion, and how can, I mean, you know, I'm somebody, I love clothes, I love colours. I remember I had about the shortest skirts you could possibly have, and if I was going out to a disco when I was a teenager, you know, my mother would make me twirl around in the kitchen just to make sure you couldn't see my knickers, you know. So I enjoyed that kind of freedom, but also, you know, what was it about? It was about going off to the local dance and showing your legs to some young bloke who might fancy you and, you know, ask you out for a date. So there's all of that sexualization that goes on in fashion that needs to be changed and challenged, and indeed is. I'm really interested in all the in the Glasgow COP26 stuff. There's what's she called, the young fashion model who's taking a really leading role in, she's there and she's been interviewing various people, and she's just recently written a book. So I think it was really interesting that a fashion model is really seriously engaged in ecofeminist struggle. So it's possible to combine the two worlds, although I wouldn't think it's that easy.
Thank you.
Lily Cole, thank you. I'm hopeless at remembering names. Thank you. I'm just looking at time. What's happened to time? Shall I move on? I was going to say something. I was going to say something about a few key concepts. I'll maybe just rattle these off. What I'll do is, if I can manage to retrieve my PowerPoint, I can send it, and then you can see it, you know, subsequent. I think some key concepts for me, and in a way we've touched on this, what the structural injustice of sexism. So in a sense, what these are kind of fundamental ideas that feminism and feminist theology works with. That there's a basic structural injustice in the relationship between the sexes, which permeates all history, all contexts, which means that there's a kind of distorted relationality between the sexes, and that comes through at every level, at the symbolic level, at the political level, at the personal level, and therefore, and we could talk a lot about what are some of the characteristics of sexism. There isn't time for that. And therefore, there's the need for some kind of fundamental conversion. And I think you find this in, I'm sure, you know, when you've looked at Black theology, you've probably looked at similar things, that we are all implicated in this fundamental structural injustice of the sexes. We are implicated and involved in different ways and at different levels according to our power, which will be different for all of us, for men, for women, for white women and white men, for, you know, women of privilege, like as I would see myself. But there is a need for all of us to recognise and name our privilege and claim the power that we have and use it to dismantle all structural injustice, but certainly that pertains between women and men. And theology, feminist theology fundamentally is doing a theology deliberately and intentionally from the perspective of women's experiences and privileging women's experiences, not because there's anything inherently better about women than men, but because women have been systematically erased and excluded from the tradition. So it's a deliberate trying to turn that on its head and seek to embrace women's experiences and learn from the insights of women in every area of theology. So maybe now just to come to, as I say, shift mode slightly, and just to give you a few little examples of some recent work. So I've just written a little book on the Lord's Prayer, and I suppose it's only really recently that I've started thinking about the Lord's Prayer more in a more intentional way. I mean, I learned the Lord's Prayer, you know, as a young child in primary school and at church, so I've prayed it my entire life. And of course, it's such a key text because it's a text that unites us with Christians throughout the ages, and in a sense takes us right back to Jesus and Jesus' own prayer practice. So it's an enormously important text. but in some ways it's problematic, like partly problematic text for feminists in at least 3 or 4 ways. One is obvious, and that is that it's, you know, the naming of God as Father, our Father in heaven. The fatherhood of God is a potentially problematic notion for feminists, because what is patriarchy? Patriarchy is the rule of the fathers. Now, I would want to argue with lots of feminists that Jesus' understanding of the fatherhood of God is utterly against sort of patriarchal fatherhood. The Abba Father of Jesus is a father who loves all equally, regards all equally, demands justice and equality in the kingdom. So a number of theologians want to talk about, rather than the kingdom with a G, which can again suggest monarchical, hierarchical, kingly authority, the kingdom, those who are kin and kith with Jesus, our brother, who belong to the family of God, and therefore seek to relate to each other in a non-hierarchical, inclusive way. So Gail Ramshaw, who's an American feminist liturgist, she talks about the myth of the crown that can be seen to be embedded in the Lord's Prayer with its prayers of kingdom, which so she sort of lifts up male kingly hierarchical power. So what I've tried to do is I found very helpful the notion of improvisation. So my book, you can find lots and lots and lots of alternative versions of the Lord's Prayer. Many of them, you might know some of them, people like Jim Cotter, Janet Morley. There are lots and lots of versions. If you look online, you'll find loads and loads, and they can be very helpful. There are a few of those in the book, but on the whole, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to rewrite the Lord's Prayer. I'm trying to dialogue with it and pray it in improvised ways. And I found, so my colleague who was at Queen's but has now moved to Roehampton, Ashley Coxworth, has written a really good book on prayer, Companion to Prayer, it published by T&T Clark, and he talks in there about, in fact, I think he draws it from David Ford, who was his PhD supervisor. David Ford talks about in the Bible the way that different writers improvise on each other's texts, and in particular the way that John's Gospel improvises a lot and develops a lot of the material that's in the synoptics, but in different ways. So it's interesting. The John's Gospel doesn't have the Lord's Prayer, for example. It's in Luke and Matthew. It's not in Mark either, interestingly. But what John's Gospel has, it has a whole sequence of stuff where Jesus speaks to God as Father and reflects on the relationship between, him and his Father. So it seems to imply knowledge of the Lord's Prayer, but is an improvisation on the Lord's Prayer. And someone else, I can't remember who, talks about the Lord's Prayer. It's a basic, they kind of suggest it wasn't a one set form, because we don't actually have one set of the Lord's Prayer. We have 2 different versions in Luke and Matthew, and there's another very early version in the Didache. And somebody has suggested that Jesus prayed in a pattern that we find in the Lord's Prayer, but it wasn't necessarily exactly the same every time. And that's what we're invited to do. We're invited to pray in the pattern of the Lord's Prayer, but actually we're invited to improvise it and find our own way, like a jazz musician will riff off, a given melody, but then take it in all kinds of different ways, so that sometimes it's difficult even to hear the original. So that's the idea behind this book that will be coming out in the spring next year, where I'm improvising on the text of the Lord's Prayer and some of the ideas of the Lord's Prayer. So I'm just going to read you a few, just to give you a little bit of a flavour. And it's in chapters that works through the structure of the Lord's Prayer, and therefore some of the different ideas and theology of the Lord's Prayer. And what I use throughout is the address to God as Abba and Amma. So Abba, we know, Jesus used this because it's preserved in the Gospels and by Paul. It's the Aramaic form, and it's a kind of very intimate form of address. It's more like daddy really than father. But also we get the female version of that, Amma, which we find in the desert tradition, where we have desert Abbas and Ammas, the desert mothers and fathers. So I use these terms of address for God because for a number of reasons, but because it's not exactly father, mother. It's Abba, Amma, it's a different language, it's Aramaic, but it's an intimate form of address. It doesn't have a lot of the connotations and baggage of father, mother. So I use these terms throughout. And some of the prayers are indeed to Abba, father, some of them are to Amma as mother, some of them are to both. And they are inspired by all sorts of different things. So here's one which is actually based on a scriptural passage. Some of them are based on other things. This one's based on Isaiah 64, 6-11, where you actually get in a very short passage a number of different metaphors for God. You get God as the father, the mother, but also the potter and the maker. So I'm riffing around all of those images. Abba, our Father, look upon us as we pray. Amma, our mother, do not turn away from us. Pater, potter, you have shaped us like clay. Mater, maker, you have fired us in the flames of love. Do not reject us, for we are all the work of your hands. No one calls on your name or strives to lay hold of you throughout the world. Yet we cry to you who belong to you, who are yours. Abba, Amma, father, mother, potter, maker. And so there's a chapter on very much exploring the fatherhood and the motherhood of God, and I partly in relation to my dialogue with my own parents, because I think it's difficult to pray the Lord's Prayer without us calling on our own parents. And then the chapter after that is called Hallowed Be Your Name, and I play with a whole range of names for God that we find in the Bible, but also in Christian tradition more generally, and wanting to kind of expand. I think sometimes Christians would sort of say, because Jesus called God Father, we're only supposed to pray to God as Father. And I just think that is so ridiculous, because anybody who reads their Bible well, there's a plethora of images of God. Probably only got time for this one final one. So let me just read this one, but you can all join in because this one's got a refrain. A few of you maybe might like to unmute, but the rest of you can just do it with muted. The refrain is simply, hallowed be your name. So if I do the first line and then you all join in, hallowed be your name, that'll be a good way to end. Abba, Amma, hallowed be your name. Mother, father, hallowed be your name. Sister, brother, hallowed be your name. Grandmother, grandfather, hallowed be your name. Lover, beloved, hallowed be your name. Companion, stranger, hallowed be your name. He, she, they, hallowed be your name. Known, unknown, hallowed be your name. Bird, bear, lion, lamb, hallowed be your name. The great I am, hallowed be your name. Rock, refuge, pillar, stone, hallowed be your name. Cloud, fire, water, storm, hallowed be your name. Spirit, comforter, strengthener, friend, hallowed be your name. Thou, breath, heartbeat, pulse, hallowed be your name. Nameless, silence, wonder, love, hallowed be your name.
Thank you, Nicola. I don't know whether we've got time for questions, have we, Jane?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know, we've slightly run out of time.
That was great, thank you. It was
I
really...
don't mind if people want to hang on for a little bit longer, I don't mind, but you may all have things that you need to get to.
Right.
Just take one question, Liz, just in case anyone's
Okay.
got the.
Who's got a question that we're going to use then? Oh, nope. Looks like you've answered all the questions in advance.
Probably all want to get to have their lunch or their cup of tea or their next thing. That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. You've given us a lot to think about and to reflect on, I think. And I'll just put the link for your book into the chat now before people disappear.
Thank you.
Because I think it will be well worth having if it's like the rest of your stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of similar, but similar in format, but you know, a new journey, as it always is.
Yeah.
There's even actually at the end, there's a fun bit. I ran out of time to read you, but I have a chapter called The Canticle of the Creatures, where I imagine creatures praying the Lord's Prayer. So there's a cat's version of the Lord's Prayer. And then quite to my surprise, because I am a cat person, I found there's a dog's version of the Lord's Prayer. So if whether you're a cat or a dog person, there's a version for you.
I'll go to the dogs one.
Thank you. Lovely to be with you all. And I'm sorry about the PowerPoint failure, but I will endeavour to send it when I can manage to retrieve it.
Thank you so much, Nicola. So next week, we've got Reverend Dr. Joe Kennedy on eco-theology. So do join us next week at 1:10 if you can. Thank you so much, Nicola. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.